A quiet morning is suddenly interrupted by a knock at the door. Today is the day baby Truc Lam must go for her vaccination. Trieu Duong gently looks at his little girl, knowing she will cry, but also knowing this is how he protects her. After the clinic, instead of going straight home, he makes a quiet decision to use his hard-earned money to bring her something comforting, a new set of clothes and a small rocking chair just for her. In a simple life, these small choices carry the weight of a father's love. But how will this day unfold for the two of them? Stay with us to find out. And if you love warm, heartfelt stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your thoughts in the comments below. The first light of morning had only just begun to spread across the hills when a knock came at the door. The sound was soft, but in a quiet mountain morning, it was enough to make Trieu Duong look up from the small stove he had just lit. Baby Truc Lam was still resting in her little bed, wrapped in a thin blanket, her tiny chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. For a second, he glanced at her before stepping outside. A male commune official stood there with a calm but purposeful expression. He greeted Trieu Duong and told him that today was the scheduled vaccination day for baby Truc Lam. He reminded him to bring her to the commune clinic before it got too late. Trieu Duong listened carefully and nodded right away. He had been waiting for this day, knowing it was important for protecting his daughter's health as she grew. Even though he always felt a small ache in his heart at the thought of hearing her cry from the injection, he understood that this was one more thing he had to do to keep her safe. After thanking the commune official, he stepped back inside and looked toward his baby again. Truc Lam had started to stir, her little hands moving near her cheeks as if she could already sense the day beginning. Trieu Duong crouched beside her and smiled softly. "Good morning, little one," he whispered. "Today we have to go out together." He carefully lifted her into his arms, holding her close against his chest. Her eyes slowly opened, still sleepy, and she looked up at him with that quiet, trusting gaze that always made him feel both proud and deeply responsible. There was no room in his life now for carelessness or delay. Every decision he made had to lead back to one thing: giving Truc Lam the safest and warmest life he could. Before they could leave for the clinic, there was still work waiting. Behind the house, the cucumber vines had been growing well, and the fruit was finally ready to pick. Trieu Duong knew that if he harvested them this morning, he could sell them on the way back and use the money for something useful. In a life like his, every small harvest mattered. Every basket of vegetables meant food, medicine, clothes, or another small comfort for his baby girl. He fed Truc Lam first, making sure she was calm and comfortable. Then he changed her clothes, choosing something soft and light for the trip. He checked her blanket, adjusted the cloth carrier, and secured her gently against his back so she would stay close to him while he worked. Once she was settled, he walked out to the garden with a woven basket in hand. The air was cool and fresh, still carrying traces of the night. Dew clung to the leaves, and the cucumber vines stretched across their supports, full of green fruit hidden beneath broad leaves. Trieu Duong moved carefully, one hand steadying the basket and the other reaching in to harvest the cucumbers one by one. He chose the best ones first, straight, firm, and bright green. Behind him, Truc Lam rested quietly against his back, her small body warmed by his own. Every now and then, he turned his head slightly to check on her, speaking to her in a gentle voice as he worked. "Just a little more, Truc Lam. We'll finish soon." He kept his movements slow and steady, never forgetting she was there. That was the rhythm of his life now. Even the simplest task, Harvesting vegetables in the early morning had changed since becoming a father. He no longer worked only for survival. He worked with a reason in his arms, on his back, and in his heart. By the time the basket was half full, the sun had climbed a little higher. The garden looked brighter now, and Trieu Duong decided that was enough. He didn't want to risk being late. He carried the cucumbers inside, set them aside neatly, and began preparing for the trip. He packed everything with the kind of care only a devoted father would understand. A cloth for wiping Truc Lam if she cried, a bottle in case she grew hungry, an extra wrap in case the weather changed. He checked everything twice before leaving. Then he lifted the basket of cucumbers in one hand and held Truc Lam close with the other as they set off down the road. The journey to the commune clinic was not easy, but Trieu Duong had long grown used to hardship. The path was uneven in places, and he walked carefully to keep from jostling the baby too much. Sometimes he spoke to her just so she would hear his voice and know he was there. "You're doing well," he said softly. "Dad is here." When they finally arrived, a few other parents were already there with their children. The atmosphere was calm, but Trieu Duong still felt a familiar tension in his chest. He sat down with Truc Lam in his lap and waited patiently for their turn. She looked around curiously, blinking at the unfamiliar place, then reached her hand toward his shirt as if to anchor herself. When her name was called, he stood up and walked inside. The medical staff smiled kindly and explained the vaccination again. Trieu Duong listened carefully, nodding as they spoke. Then came the moment he had been dreading. He held Truc Lam securely while the injection was prepared. As soon as it was done, Truc Lam let out a cry, sharp, sudden, heartbreaking, in the way only a baby's cry can be. Trieu Duong's face tightened for a moment, and he immediately gathered her close, rocking her gently. "It's okay, he murmured. "Dad is here, Dad is here." He patted her back, kissed the top of her head, and kept whispering until her cries began to weaken. It hurt him to see her in discomfort, but beneath that pain was relief. This small moment of tears meant protection for the days ahead. It meant he was doing what he needed to do as her father. After the vaccination, he stayed a while to make sure she was all right. He didn't rush. He watched her face, felt her temperature, and waited until she had settled against his chest again. Only then did he prepare to leave. On the way home, instead of heading straight back, Trieu Duong turned toward the market. The basket of cucumbers still hung from his arm, and now that the clinic visit was over, he wanted to make the most of the trip. If he could sell the cucumbers today, he could bring back something more than just peace of mind. He could bring back another small piece of comfort for Truc Lam. The market was already lively when they arrived. Voices rose and fell from every direction. Vendors called out prices, buyers moved from stall to stall, and the smell of herbs, vegetables, and cooked food drifted through the air. Trieu Duong found a small space and laid out his cucumbers neatly, arranging them so they looked fresh and appealing. It didn't take long for people to notice. The cucumbers were clean, young, and freshly picked that morning. A woman stopped first, asking the price. Then another followed. Some glanced at the baby, smiled, and said kind things about how calm she was. Trieu Duong answered, politely, but his focus remained on selling well and quickly. The sooner he finished, the sooner he could use that money for something meaningful. Little by little, the basket grew lighter, and as the last of the cucumbers began to disappear into other people's bags, Trieu Duong looked down at Truc Lam and smiled to himself. The morning had already been long. His daughter had gone through something difficult. She had cried, then trusted him enough to calm down in his arms. Now he wanted to reward that bravery in the only way he could. Not with grand things, but with practical care, warmth, and a small joy made possible by his own hands. He folded the money carefully and slipped it into his pocket, already knowing exactly what he wanted to do next. With the last of the cucumbers sold, Trieu Duong stood quietly for a moment, his hand resting protectively on Truc Lam as she lay against his chest. The market was still busy around them, voices blending into a constant hum. But his thoughts had already moved forward. He reached into his pocket and carefully unfolded the money he had just earned. It wasn't much, but to him it carried weight. Every coin, every small note came from his own hands. Early work, steady effort, and a constant purpose to give his daughter a safer and more comfortable life. He looked down at Truc Lam. She had been through a long morning, the unfamiliar place, the injection, the tears. Yet she had trusted him, calmed in his arms, and now rested quietly against him again. He knew exactly what he needed to do next. Instead of heading home right away, Trieu Duong walked deeper into the market, toward a section where people sold young plants and seeds. If he could grow more food himself, it would mean more stability in the days ahead. Not just for him, but for Truc Lam as she grew older. He stopped in front of a small stall filled with trays of green seedlings. Rows of young plants stood upright, their leaves fresh and full of life. He crouched down and examined them carefully, his eyes moving from one tray to another. He chose slowly, not in a hurry, making sure he picked the healthiest ones. "These are good," he said quietly. The vendor nodded and explained how to care for them, how much water they needed, how to protect them from strong sun and heavy rain. Trieu Duong listened closely, asking a few simple questions to be sure he understood. Then he made his decision. "I'll take these seedlings." The vendor carefully gathered the young plants and wrapped their roots so they could survive the journey home. Trieu Duong held them gently, as if they were something fragile. In his mind, he was already seeing the future. Small plants growing into a garden that could feed them, support them, and reduce the hardships ahead. This wasn't just a purchase, it was a step toward building something lasting for his daughter. As he stood up, he adjusted Truc Lam slightly, making sure she was still comfortable. Then as he turned to leave, his eyes caught something nearby. A stall with children's clothes. Soft fabrics hung neatly in the light, small outfits swaying gently as people passed by. Trieu Duong slowed down without even realizing it. His gaze rested on a tiny set of clothes, simple, clean, and soft enough for a baby's delicate skin. He looked at Truc Lam again. Most of what she wore now was practical, used carefully day after day. But today felt different. She had gone through something difficult. She had cried in his arms, then trusted him enough to calm down. He wanted to give her something more than just necessity. He stepped closer and picked up a small outfit, running his fingers lightly over the fabric to check its softness. "How much is this?" he asked. After hearing the price, he nodded and paid without hesitation. The vendor folded the clothes neatly and handed them to him. Trieu Duong placed them carefully into his bag, as if protecting them from the crowd around him. It was a small thing, but to him it meant warmth. It meant care. It meant that even in a simple life, his daughter could still have something new, something just for her. As he continued walking, another stall drew his attention. This one displayed wooden baby items, simple but well-crafted. Among them was a small rocking chair for a baby. It wasn't decorated, but its shape was smooth, its structure sturdy, and its movement gentle. Trieu Duong stopped. He stood there quietly, observing it. In his mind, he could already see Truc Lam lying there, her small body gently rocking, her face calm, maybe even smiling as she felt the soothing motion. At home, she mostly lay in her bed or stayed close to him while he worked. But he knew she needed a space of her own, a place where she could rest comfortably, where she could feel safe even when he was busy nearby. He crouched down and touched the rocking chair, pushing it slightly to test its movement. It rocked smoothly without noise, steady and safe. He didn't think for long. "I'll take this one," he said. The vendor helped wrap it simply so it could be carried more easily. Now, with a bundle of seedlings in one hand, a bag with new clothes, and the small rocking chair secured carefully, Trieu Duong prepared to head home. The walk back felt heavier, not because of the weight, but because of responsibility. Every step had to be careful. He adjusted his hold often, making sure Truc Lam was comfortable, that the seedlings were safe, that nothing slipped. The sun had risen higher now, warming the path. Occasionally, he paused for a moment just to check on her. "You're doing well," he whispered softly. "Dad is here." By the time they reached home, the quiet of the place welcomed them back. Trieu Duong didn't rush. He first placed the seedlings in a shaded area and gently arranged them so they could stay fresh before planting. He made sure their roots were still moist, adjusting them carefully. Then he brought the clothes inside and set them aside neatly, keeping them clean and safe. Finally, he turned to the small rocking chair. He placed it on the floor and tested it again, making sure it was stable. Only when he was fully satisfied did he gently lift Truc Lam and lay her down. For a brief moment, she seemed unsure. Her eyes moved slowly, adjusting to the new position. Then, as the chair began to rock softly, her body relaxed. Her small hands moved gently. Her breathing slowed. And then, she smiled. A soft, quiet smile. Not loud, not exaggerated. Just a simple expression of comfort and safety. Trieu Duong sat beside her, one hand resting lightly near the chair, ready to steady it at any moment. His eyes never left her. Even in rest, even in calm, his attention remained constant. The long morning, the early visit from the commune official, the work in the garden, the careful journey to the clinic, the moment of tears, the effort at the market, all of it led to this moment. A moment where his daughter felt safe, a moment where she could rest peacefully. And as the gentle rocking continued, Trieu Duong allowed himself a small breath of relief. Today, he had done enough for her. Early one morning, a commune official reminds Trieu Duong to take baby Truc Lam for her scheduled vaccination. Though he knows it will be painful for her, he carefully prepares everything and carries her to the clinic. After the injection, Truc Lam cries, and he gently comforts her until she feels safe again in his arms. On the way home, instead of returning immediately, he stops by the market to make the most of the trip. Using the money he earned from selling cucumbers, he chooses to buy small but meaningful things for his daughter. A soft new outfit and a simple rocking chair. Back home, as Truc Lam lies peacefully and begins to smile, Trieu Duong quietly realizes that every effort he makes, no matter how small, is all for her comfort, safety, and future.